like if we talk about shame, it's like, I hated myself as a kind of 14-year-old. I just wanted to die, really. But the thing, it drove me out of hide. It got me to kind of explore new things. I was aware of punk. It was on my radar, and I was like, oh, this is really interesting. I think this is quite common for lots of people that ended up around punk. It wasn't so much about like a musical movement, but it was an opportunity to kind of find an escape route and change who they are.
I am Kay Anderson, and you are listening to Lost Spaces, a podcast that mourns the death of queer nightlife. Every episode, I talk to a different person about a venue from their past, the memories they created there, and the people that they used to know. This week, I caught up with the, quite frankly, charming Liz Naylor, who, amongst other things, has been a writer and music industry bod before embarking on her recent adventure as one of the founders of charity Foundation for Change. We caught up to discuss the Manchester scene in the late 70s, how grim lesbian bars were at the time, butches and femmes, and the overlaps between the punk and the queer scene.
Well, the Picador was a club in kind of, I think it was around Shude Hill in Manchester, and it was owned by Fufu Lamar at some point, but it sort of has a really kind of sketchy history. I did a bit of research into this, and it had sort of been a sort of shabby little nightclub from, I think, sort of 50s onwards, and by 1979, it was called the Picador, and it was a lesbian club. And I was taken there by sort of somebody I'd met really randomly through punk. And there's the whole kind of, it's important because it was like the end of an era of, butches at the bar, kind of femmes sitting down. It was it was like a kind of regional gateways, it wasn't quite as busy or quite as well known or actually quite as affluent, but like it was a proper old school weird lesbian bar.
Well, I want to find out more about this, but before we do, who is Fufu Lamar?
Okay, Fufu Lamar was a very famous, obviously not that famous, but a kind of, in Manchester, Fufu Lamar was a sort of a drag artist who owned a few nightclubs. He was a bit of a, Mr. Manchester style, it was quite kind of mainstream. People kind of knew him as a bit of a, like Manchester's Danny LaRue sort of thing.
Oh, okay.
So Fufu owned a few nightclubs, and one of them, there's a weird sort of, what I sort of was interested in talking about is there's a weird like gay scene kind of punk crossover that happens.
Okay.
This is like this really interesting kind of little bit of history in Manchester. I don't mean it happens in London with Louises and Sex Pistols kind of frequenting kind of lesbian clubs as well, but there's an equivalent in Manchester. So that's where I wanted to start off.
And so, who took you there?
Well, I have to be a bit careful.
No, you don't. No one will listen.
No. It's just the way it was somebody. I went to see a punk band called The Distractions, and their bass player was, and is sort of trans, but that concept wasn't around then. So, as far as I knew, it was like, oh, it's the first lesbian. I knew I was a lesbian. And then I went to see this band really randomly. And it was like seeing my first live lesbian, but that didn't look like, Beryl Reid or, awful kind of thing, depictions of lesbians I'd seen on the telly.
Wait, now I feel really dumb. Who is Beryl Reid?
Okay, Beryl Reid. Beryl Reid was the main character in The Killing of Sister George.
Okay.
So, as a young lesbian, you had no kind of access to any kind of visual representation of your world.
Yeah.
It was like having to imagine the way the world was without a map. So all I had was like this terrible film that I'd seen one night on telly, where lesbians were awful and, unhappy.
Mm.
And I mean, there were obviously equivalences for gay men. So all you kind of see are these really, really sort
negative depictions. Yeah.
Exactly. So I kind of knew I was a lesbian, but I looked and thought, well, I'm not one of them. It made no sense to me. And then I sort of went to see this kind of punk band. It was 1978. Now, punk was very important for me because it gave you a sense of, you could be something else. You could be weak. I went to this punk band in 1978. I'm 15 years old. Had no idea how to sort of escape my home and, become a lesbian. It's like, I don't know how to become one, right? So, and I lived in a place called Hyde, which was sort of small market town in Manchester, which is interestingly the world's kind of murder capital. 2 serial killers come from Hyde, being the Morse murderers and Harold Shipman.
Oh, nice thing to be proud of for the town.
Yeah. Don't put it on there, kind of welcome to Hyde, sign as you go in. The home of them. So that, like, the chance of having 2 mass murders from one small town is quite odd.
I feel like there's something to bond over here, though, because I grew up in Adelaide, which is the murder capital of Australia. Not the world, but Australia.
There you go. Well, you know what? I don't know. I've never been to Adelaide, but
well, I mean, you not many people get out.
Well, that was like, I'm laughing, but yeah, there was I am laughing, but in 1977 and 1978, there was a real sense of like, if I don't get out of here, I will be here forever.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't be because I'm a lesbian, because I'm the only lesbian in Hyde forever. But I could, it was the kind of place where people grew up there and were, got married and kind of lived there. Mm-hmm. So, that kind of that desire to kind of escape one's physical kind of surroundings was very strong. And so I go to see this punk band called The Distractions. They have a bass player who, as I say, was trans, but that was a kind of unknown concept as well. So I saw somebody who was a really cool lesbian who looked fucking great. And I just kind of went up and went, hello, I need to talk to you. I think I might be a lesbian. And
do you have a pamphlet or anything?
Yeah, exactly. Pip then arranged to meet me. It must have been like the following weekend. It was a real kind of, right, I'll be there at a gay club. It was a gay pub, and it was the first gay pub I'd ever been to, called the Union, or the New Union. And then Pip took me to the Picador. And it was kind of terrifying. I mean, I kind of remember feeling really, really. It was Shude Hill was a kind of very rundown. It was kind of very rundown part of the city then. I mean, Manchester was a bit of a bomb site at that point as well. But Shude Hill was a particularly sort of grubby and unpleasant part of the city, and the Picador was up. It's like you get to this doorway and go up this really kind of rickety stairs. There was no kind of frontage or anything. And then you come into what is like somebody's small front room with a bar and a DJ kind of decks in the corner and a few chairs. And it was nightclubs in 1978, lesbian and gay nightclubs were like a bar and, a few butches standing around leaning against the bar and femmes sitting at the table, and like often jukebox, or I think when I went to the Picador, they had a DJ, I think, but it wasn't every night wasn't DJ night. So it was very basic.
And so is that why you met in the Union? Because it was such a like off the beaten track type venue?
I think Pip went to the Union. Pip was a bit older than me, but I was 15 and looked about 12. And I really did. I looked really young, and I thought, there's no way I'm going to get served. And I walked into the union, and I remember, I'm quite old now, but, I remember the woman behind the bar going, "What do you want, little un?" And, and I said something like, "A pint of lager, please." And they just didn't bat an eyelid. And the union was absolutely fantastic. It was full of absolute weirdos, and I say that kindly, people who had just been kind of rejected, I guess, by the straight world, and that it really kind of made sense to me. I'm like, oh, I'm home, these are my people. And then so the Picador and Dickens was the other place I'd go, the other nightclub I'd go, although I think it was probably a little later because Dickens were a little more select about letting people in. They had a door person. So I think at 15 I don't think I'd have got into Dickens. I think I went to Dickens more like when I was 16, 17, so it would be like 79, 80. I was thinking.
So talk to me then about Canal Street, because Canal Street, for those who don't know, is the gay strip in Manchester. And whenever I think about it as a very commercialized, mainstream type gay venue street. I'm trying not to be like really dismissive with the words I'd say. But you just said that when you went to the union, it was full of kind of freaks and outcasts. Was the scene very different then?
Yeah, totally. I mean, there was, at that point, Canal Street it looked like something from, there's a film of Sheila Delaney's Taste of Honey, which I think's filmed in about 1962 in Salford, and it's black and white film, and it's kind of full of shots of, black filthy canals and kind of factories belching smoke and barefooted children. And Canal Street was kind of a bit like that. In 79 there were no other clubs. There was at the top end, kind of near Piccadilly, was the Rembrandt Hotel, which is still there, and that was kind of very much like gay men. They weren't particularly friendly if you went in as a lesbian. There's a pub called New York, and there was the Union, and the Union was the most, welcoming. It was welcoming in a way. And the people that went there, it wasn't like a gay pub, and it wasn't a queer pub. The people that went there were prostitutes, they're punters, really, really bad transvestites, and just people that were just fucked. It was just there used to be somebody walking around called Pinky, who used to just walk around selling blues, like Dexy tablets, going blues 3 for £1, blues 3 for £1. So it was just.
Wait, I'm so sorry. I'm so ignorant. And what are blues?
Like speed tablets.
Oh, okay. Right, I'm with you.
So you get served. You buy drugs and you'd have a wild time, but it wasn't. I mean, now you'd sort of say it was queer. I mean, it was genuinely a queer space. I think, I have a bit of a kind of issue with that, because I think it's a bit ahistoric, because it didn't feel like a queer space to me, or I'm sure anybody else, in 1979 or 1978 or in 1968 when people were there. And this idea of sort of renaming it a queer space, I think sort of it kind of negates, or it I don't know, it shuts down the actual way that people were inventing themselves and inventing their world, And
it imposes our current lens on it rather than accepting it for what it was. But if it wasn't queer, then how would you have described it?
Well, it was just full of weirdos, and it was absolutely fantastic to be amongst weirdos, because that's what I felt like, I didn't sort of think, oh, great, I'm a lesbian, how cool. I just felt weird, and I loved being around weirdos. I really kind of, I was very, went to the Union probably, once a week at least, regularly. I was quite poor, so I kind of couldn't do a lot of drinking, but, I was in there from 78 to 80. 182. And it was a very important space for me then, but it's so hard to try to convey how different Canal Street was in those days. It was like this kind of grim cobbled street next to the canal, and the prostitutes used to take their punters down to the canal bridge right near the Union, and give them a hand job or something, and then be back in the pub.
Well, you didn't have wet wipes then, did you?
No, it was really grimy, it was, and the Union by that point hadn't been done up. And there's a Martin Parr photo. The photographer Martin Parr took a photo of the Union I think it's about 75, 76, this photo, and it was pretty much like that when I first went there. There was jukebox that was kind of playing like weird 60s kind of Dusty Springfield, very sort of, it wasn't up to date stuff. And there was a live drummer, this woman called Sandy, used to pack herself with a pair of socks, playing the drums, singing Bobby's Girl. And it was just, that was the entertainment.
Why do you need to, what? Why do you need to pack yourself with a pair of socks to play the drums?
She was in full kind of, male attire at the drums, singing and drumming at the same time, but not a lot like Karen Carpenter. So,
like Manchester's version of Karen Carpenter.
Yeah, Butch Karen Carpenter, singing I Want to Be Bobby's Girl, and then there'd be sort of sing-along. So it was like some weird, it felt like something from a different decade, even then. And, it was a very strange place, but it was a wonderful place. So we'd always meet at the Union, and then we'd go off to these kind of strange lesbian clubs.
And then so was it quite segregated then, in that each bar on Canal Street had its own distinct identity and clientele?
Yes.
Okay.
So Union was like absolute weirdos went to the Union, and it's kind of a bit like that now. I last went about 10 years ago, I must say, and it was full of very working class people who were getting really, really pissed to really shit 90s kind of Dr. Alban kind of,
Wait. Did you just say Dr. Alban was shit?
I'm sorry. But it was like kind of like somebody bought a kind of 90s, mid-90s dance compilation from a cart booth sale and whacked it on really loud, and the pub was just going mental to it. It was a bit like Shameless.
Okay.
When I went about 10 years ago, so the vibe is very much the same. So that was the Union. That New York was a bit kind of more sedate, and it was a bit hit and miss whether I could get served in there. Certainly when I was young, they were a bit suspicious. The Rembrandt, as I said, was very much like gay men, and as a lesbian, you probably would enter and just get ignored. And also I was kind of punky lesbian as well, so kind of looked wrong. So I don't think I ever really drank in the Rembrandt. And then the Thompson's Arms was there, which was next to the coach station. And the Thompson's Arms was predominantly gay men, but also kind of Perry boys, which are kind of they're a kind of sort of Manchester thing. And Perry boys I was terrified of Perry boys. They'd kind of chase you and beat you up. But they were kind of weird, sort of rent boy, but kind of straight, gay for pay style.
Oh, okay.
Kind of, sort of football hooligan, not a football hooligan, but they'd been Soul Boys and Bowie fans. So it's a really fascinating little bit of kind of youth subculture that exists in Manchester in the late 70s and early 80s. And, a few people were pretty scared of gangs of Perry boys. They were pretty nasty, but they used to like drinking in the Thompson's Arms. I think, that's where they picked up quite a lot of their business.
Just falling into a bit of a Google hole, finding out about Perry Boys, because I'd never heard of them. Perry Boys were notorious for attending Manchester United matches abroad and shoplifting luxury brand clothing and jewellery from upscale boutiques.
But strangely, for all their, heterosexuality, they frequented the Thompson's Arms quite a lot. So there was some weird Perry boy, kind of red boy crossover in the Thompsons. And then there was a gay club on the opposite corner called Napoleon's, which was just like strictly like no women in there. at all.
Ah.
Not like, don't even try it. But yeah, it was really segregated, actually.
Oh, interesting. And so you'd go to the Union, have a pint, and then you'd go off to one of these secret lesbian bars that you were talking about. What was the lesbian scene like?
It was very small, you know.
So,
I don't know.
You know how times have changed.
Yeah, yeah. It's kind of, it felt like you saw the same faces again and again and again, and there were very little options. And there was quite a lot of the lesbian scene around the Union that also drank in the Picador, and then also drank in Dickens, were kind of very working class women from North Manchester, Collyhurst and Moston, that are very kind of, you know, economically deprived areas. I mean, you know, and have been for years and years and years. And they, you know, they were kind of the first time I kind of met lesbians who had kids, who'd been married and, you know, kind of worked at kind of normal jobs. They weren't, you know, they weren't kind of middle class lesbians. So there's this kind of very sort of working class lesbian scene around the Union and the bars I went to. Mm-hmm. And later in the late 70s, a bar called Swithin's that nobody remembers opened in Back Thomas Street, I think. Again, kind of all around where the Northern Quarter is now in Manchester. Mm. And so these bars were very, like I say, they were just like, you'd go and it was like somebody's front room with some really, really hideous pattern carpet.
So talk to me about the Picador then. Do you remember what the carpet was like?
No, well, having said that, I remember the carpet in Dickens a lot because it was like brown swirly. It was like your nan's carpet. It was just incredible. So Picador, I kind of remember just the really weird rickety stairs and going up, and it was on 3 levels, which makes it sound like a really, you know, plush nightclub. It wasn't. It was just like 3 tiny little rooms kind of on top of each other.
Did they have their own kind of distinct activity happening in them?
I think they were just like rooms with chairs in and sit and drink, and that was it. I think that, and interestingly, like the thing about Picador is I went there first. It must be like maybe 79, if kind of, I think probably early 79 I went there, and then it changed its name to Oozits, and while it was Oozits, oh God, how do I explain this? I'd become friends with the guy called Richard Boone, who was, ran a record company in Manchester and managed a band called the Buzzcocks. And Richard wanted to open a nightclub, and I went, "Oh, I know a really sleazy place. You know, it's great. No fans there." And Richard opened a club called the Beach Club on a Tuesday night that ran from Oozits. They hide it out because, like, basically nobody was going to Oozits. And New Order play their first gig there. I mean, it's quite an important, music venue in Manchester's history. And kind of, I think it runs for like a year or so. And Richard used like there was the downstairs bar room, and then there was a middle room where they used to show films, and the top floor where bands played.
And so when it became Oozits, did it stop being a lesbian bar?
I don't think so. I mean, I think, I can just remember it being not many people being there. And I can't, the thing is, if I'm honest, Gabe, I can't remember whether like I went every Wednesday night, which was lesbian night.
Yeah.
It is sketchy. It's a really long time ago. And I just remember it being the first time I'd ever been to a lesbian bar, and I didn't know what you did there. You certainly didn't dance. Nobody was dancing.
So should we talk then about that? So you mentioned butches and femmes before, and how this was kind of the last gasp of that type of scene. What was the, like, so to me, when people talk about butches and femmes, I'm always like, right, so the butchers are on one side of the room and they are eyeing up the femmes on the other side of the room. But what is it actually like?
It was like that.
Oh, okay.
It's kind of interesting. There's an artist called Linda Sterling. It's quite a big deal kind of visual artist these days. And Linda has got some photos that she took in Dickens, which is the other bit of nightclub, in late 70s. And you can see butches in there, and they're dressed like, I mean, it's really interesting how lesbians kind of choose their kind of visual style. But in the 70s, the butches were dressed like, blazers and really bad trousers, and, just like they're dressed like your dad. I didn't have a dad, but, or your kind of, your elderly uncle or something. So the visual style for butches was, just sort of
M&S cardigans and
It was, and femmes were, just femmes were just femmes. Femmes are kind of, long hair, and it's sort of it was just this very sort of coded sort of world.
What? So the only criteria to be considered femme was to have long hair?
I think so. Yes. It seemed to me, and it's really interesting because, like, actually the last time I properly went out clubbing was about 13 years ago. I started to go to Bar Whatever in London, and I really sort of loved it because it was partly it was a bit like, oh, this is like, this is full circle. It's like, there are butches and femmes, but they're playing with it. And, the thing about Bar Whatever is it was playful. It was quite stylish. It was people kind of enjoying those roles. Whereas if we're talking about Manchester in 79, it felt really, really grim. It felt, I used to look at these butches and think, I am butch, but I used to look at butches and just think, oh my God, I don't want to be them. I just like, that's a horrific thought for me, that this is who I am.
Well, that's really interesting, because I was going to ask that. So, young, impressionable, first time on the scene, and being that there are these two distinct tribes, did you feel any pressure to conform?
Yeah, I guess. I didn't know. It must have been a pressure. I mean, actually, I kind of didn't know how to be, and I was quite, I was very fucked up. Young woman. I'd been expelled from school and kind of had loads of other, really difficult stuff happen to me around my mental health. So I was absolutely off my fucking rocker most of the time. And I just kind of, but, I think in common sort of laughing in a kind of slightly defensive way, I think, as anybody who's kind of experienced kind of poor mental health, it's like I just didn't understand how the world worked. It was like I didn't have the instructions for it. So I knew I wanted to be in relationships with women, but I'd go into these kind of social settings and just think, oh, I don't really know how to be butch. So certainly, my hair was short. Okay, I'm not a femme, but it didn't really make sense. And I think, looking back, that's also why the union made a lot more sense to me, because it was fluid. It's like, the lesbians were actually, sex workers. They were going off and kind of shagging blokes and coming back in, and like everything was up for, well, what is it? Whereas the kind of the club scene at that point was a lot more codified, I think.
But then there's this other kind of layer there as well in terms of the punk scene. Yeah. And how did that intersect for you?
It's always sort of been there, and it was sort of before my days, but the kind of very early punk scene in Manchester is 76, 77. And the main venue that bands played and all those kind of very early punks met was a place called The Ranch. And The Ranch was owned by Foo Foo Lamar, and The Ranch was...
I know who that is now.
Yeah, exactly. I was like, I'm not a representative of the estate of Foo Foo Lamar. But basically, Foo Foo Lamar owned a Foo Foo's place, I think it was called, a kind of one of those venues where kind of straight office workers would go and watch a drag act.
Okay,
yeah. It was quite kind of popular and boozy and kind of very working class. And then he had this other venue that I think wasn't earning any money, and then it was kind of like he was struggling with. And then I think somebody said, can we put on gigs here? And, Foo kind of went, well, yeah, okay, because we need the money. And the same thing happened with the Picador / Use It when Richard went to them and went, oh, can we hire it on a Tuesday evening? We want to put gigs on. So there's always been this kind of history of punk in Manchester happening in gay or lesbian, places, because they were the venues that
said yes.
Yes, said yes. I don't know whether it was. I don't think it was through any kind of. I don't know what it was for, actually. It's really hard to say, isn't it? I was just about to say, oh, I'm sure it was just kind of financial, but actually, there is something going on where people recognise otherness, isn't there? In each. So that otherness could exist in those places, and. Yes, they were very they were places that were the most tolerant of punk.
But in referring back to the butch and femmes, were you able to reject that because you could see yourself as a punk?
Yes, totally. I mean, that's a kind of an astute point. It's like I don't I'm 58 now, and I don't sit around listening to punk music. It kind of musically it doesn't really kind of mean anything to me. What it was this fantastic way to. A kind of alternative identity that was beyond butch or femme, and it was a weird, the most easiest way to understand it, though we should resist labeling it, but it was a queer identity, and I just didn't fit in to the world of butch or femme either, so I was punky, and those places. Those kind of the Picador, Dickens, the lesbians who were there kind of, I think, probably just thought I was weird, and I was weird because I didn't look like them. Around this time, in about 79, me and my sort of first girlfriend, Kath, moved. We were given a council flat in a place called Collyhurst in North Manchester, where lots of those kind of lesbians lived around there. And honestly, kind of, I've forgotten this, but Kath remembers it well. We were just every night chased by gangs of youths and who threw stones, would throw stones and fucking rocks at us. And really,
because they identified you as lesbians.
Yeah.
Oh wow.
And weird, and it was really terrifying stuff. And I really, and Kath remembers a gang following us home and just going, "We're going to burn your flat down, you queer, you lesers."
And probably. You don't remember this?
I actually think it was quite traumatic. And we had a really traumatic time living there. It was really horrible, and we were desperately poor and frightened, right? So, but that, like Collyhurst was the heart of that kind of working class culture. Culture. Sorry, that was kind of a wrong word to use. That you just like, it was there. It was a really terrifying place to live. It was a culture. I don't know. It wasn't. It didn't represent a culture, but. But so what am I trying to say here is, like, they were the same people that were in the clubs that we were living around, but they weren't weird, but they were weird. Oh, this is a kind of, I'm
weird.
digging myself into the hole here, but I'm trying to kind of say that, those lesbian clubs at the time were full of just very, very, rough working class people doing drugs and dressing in the wrong, men dressing up as women. But then punk was another identity.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Do we want to talk about Kath? No.
No, I don't know. I mean, she's, she was my first girlfriend, but she is just, then for the rest of her life heterosexual. Probably.
Oh wow!
It's like one of those. Yes, it is like one of those kind of classic kind of filmy type romance. Where you meet somebody and they oh God, what am I trying to say? It was all very kind of, she's a year or so older than me. So I met her when I was 15. So probably kind of later on, 78 later on, I met her, maybe early 79. And she was probably a year older than me. So I was 17, she was 18. She felt a lot, she felt a lot older than me. Because when you're that age, a year makes all the difference. And it all just was terribly fraught. What I'm trying to say is like, it was this classic kind of teenage, really, really overly fraught, painful relationship.
Delicious.
Yeah, I know. And all we gays have. What I was trying to say earlier is like, as kind of few gay men I know have also had this very similar experience of kind of falling in love with somebody, or them falling in love with, like, somebody straight falling in love with them, by the way, and they all being really painful and kind of, difficult. I don't know if it is anymore. Maybe kids just like, yeah, whatever. But in 1979, you had to decide whether you were straight or gay. And, even bisexual felt like a bit of a statement. And me and Kath went out. Do you know what? I think we probably went out with each other for like 6 months or something. And then split up. But we carried on living together and working together for years afterwards. But it was painful. Yeah.
And so in that time when you carried on living and working together, did she start dating men?
Yes.
What was that like for you?
I think it was really painful for me. And I think I probably behaved really nuts, because I felt very rejected. Both sort of personally rejected, but also sort of as a lesbian. I think didn't do my lesbian self-esteem a great deal of good. And
I was so terrible that she went back to men. So
yeah. Well, and then another early girlfriend of mine called Julie, who I have no idea where she is. She was bisexual, and she left me for some punk bloke called Raptor, so I kind of like some real kind of awful punk bloke. And I remember writing her I wrote her like a nine-page letter, kind of, detailing my outrage at this. So this is like going to a therapist, Keith. I haven't thought about this stuff for ages. So I would, I kind of really liked straight girls or girls that were bisexual, because all that internalized homophobia. I didn't want to date a femme, because that would make me a butch. So I kind of, all my girlfriends were either straight or bisexual.
But so again, this is my naivety, so please put me on the right track.
Yeah.
Like, how could you tell the difference between a straight woman and a femme woman?
Oh, you can. Because what I liked were girls that were sort of slightly androgynous, and I think there's a sort of class thing going on there as well. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't describe Kath as particularly middle class, but certainly Julie was, and so I also wanted to get out of my class. I also internalized class hatred as well. And so, my God, I was no wonder I was fucked up. I was utterly confused. I was there in the union, kind of feeling like a freak, and that's where I really belonged, but really desperately like not wanting to be a butch or fen, and also desperately not wanting to be working class. I was terrified of ending up like what I saw around me. Mm. So I kind of wanted to date girls that looked like Tina Weymouth from Talking Heads. Mm-hmm. Who is, absolutely straight. I mean, there's no doubt that Tina Weymouth looks straight, but she looks kind of classy and androgynous, and that's just like or Chrissy Hind or that kind of thing. There's people, there's a real straightness to them, but there's also a confidence around their kind of ability to mm-hmm. be slightly androgynous. And I think I was really attracted to that kind of confidence as well that I saw in people. Whereas I described earlier those kind of early gay lesbian clubs in Manchester, there was a real air of desperation. I mean, those femmes weren't kind of like, yeah, I'm really loving my femininity here. The message you were getting in those clubs was like, I hate men. I've had really shit relationships with men. I'm going to try it on with some, butchers. This is where I've ended up. Honestly, there's a real weird, like, it wasn't good. It wasn't like, a kind of celebratory place to be. Those clubs.
Oh, it's really fascinating. And so you went to your first kind of queer club. Sorry, yeah. Queer. You went to your first lesbian bar at 15. Yeah. What was it? Were you still at school at that point?
No, I've been expelled from school. I was expelled from school kind of, I think around October 78.
Okay.
And so all this happens in the summer. So it's like one of those kind of make a great movie. So I break up from school, in 1978. I'm 15. I break up from school, and that summer I meet
discover yourself.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I started to kind of stay out and out. My poor mother. I started to kind of stay out at night and sleeping kind of. I used to go to gigs at the Factory in Hume, and I was going to kind of punk gigs and things like that, and I'd kind of essentially kind of run away from home. So I was a bit of a runaway in Manchester around that time, but I did. I went back to school in that September or whatever, and told my teacher to fuck off. I mean, it was so little, but in them days, and I was just expelled. They were just like, right, you're out here. And then,
oh wow.
And then I kind of was, put in a mental health unit, and it was all, there's lots of sort of trauma around that, and I think it wasn't particularly. I don't know. It wasn't particularly necessary or something, but.
Yeah. It was just an extreme response.
It was, yeah. And it was a lot to do with the fact that I'd kind of, if you like, broken up for my summer holiday. And that summer, 78, I cut my hair and I was like, right, I'm a lesbian now. I went to the union and I understood that's what I want to be. And I went back to school, and there was just no way that identity was,
tolerated. Yeah.
And I went to a very straight girls' school, and all the girls had kind of Farrah Fawcett kind of flicked kind of 80s, 70s hairdos, and they all.
So they'd all be classified as femmes, yeah.
Yeah.
And so then what happened? So it sounds like you were, there was a bit of a light. No, well, I don't know if this is the metaphor to use, but like a light switched on, and you went from like not really knowing to being very adamant about lesbianism, your lesbianism. Sorry, making it sound like a disease. And so what did that mean for your home life?
Well, I left home. Then I left. Well, okay, my mother just didn't mention it. I think, during that kind of late 78 when I was kind of running, I wasn't really kind of running away, but I'd go to Manchester. I just wouldn't come back, and I'd sort of slept on floors and things like that. I wasn't street homeless. I would just keep on people's floors and that. So there's a bit of a sort of punk community that were quite supportive. And my mother was just kind of distraught, I think, but didn't really mention the lesbianism. It was just my delinquency. That was the problem.
Okay.
Like the lesbianism was kind of hidden by the fact that I'd become a punk and, would kind of stay out all night and things like that. So there wasn't a kind of moment where my mother went, oh my God, you're a lesbian, aren't you? That's sort of like, even though it's really funny, I kind of was also, I'd started to wear men's clothes as well, but in a, not, oh God, this is so complicated to describe, in words, but I'd also started to wear men's clothes in a way that was kind of punky and cool, not like the butches I saw. I didn't look like I was modelling for Kay's catalogue or something. I was wearing like old kind of suits I got from the Salvation Army and things like that. And I can remember I was essentially sectioned in a mental health unit, and I remember them asking me why I wore men's clothes. They were like, well, why are you wearing men's clothes? And I was just like, well, it's cool, innit? Fuck off, I'm a punk kind of thing. So that kind of identity as punk and you know, my sexuality were so sort of entwined, you know. But I think my mother just chose to address the more delinquent, as I say, the more delinquent parts of my personality.
It's so interesting, though, isn't it, that in the mental health unit they were like, well, this must be like part of the reason because you're wearing clothes that aren't for the gender you're been assigned. Like, that's just so bizarre.
I find all this, you know, because I actually haven't worn female clothes since, you know, since, well, you know, May 1978 now, you know. I kind of just, you know, it was that summer just allowed me to be who I felt I was, actually. And so it's kind of it's really odd being kind of older and single, kind of the debate around trans stuff. You know, I find it quite painful. I mean, I find it's kind of quite painful and upsetting to sort of see how that's polarizing people. But it's also kind of a weird sort of sense of, just my own past, you know, in this. And it's not an identity. I mean, I just feel like I'm a middle-aged lesbian. You know, I'm a woman. I just like, but in those days, I think my identity was very difficult for me. It was very difficult being a woman in those early times.
So, do you want to talk about this a bit more? So, why do you find it difficult around the trans debate at the moment?
Well, the interesting thing is, I know actually I kind of like I'm personally sort of friends with people who are both who represent, you know, either sides of the debate.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and I find it, I just find it really kind of black and whitey and painful, because my own identity has moved around so much through, you know, whatever, you know, since my late teens. I think I find it painful. Oh God, I really didn't want to talk about this. I'll keep it brief, but I think during that time, if trans had been a kind of an identity, I'd have very much taken that on. So I think I find it difficult because it's like, it's not something I particularly want to take on now. It feels like, you know, an odd thing to do. But I know that if trans had been around, I mean, kind of people were trans, you know. I don't want to sort of, kind of, yeah. I mean, but as a sort of concept, it wasn't really discussed. People were just like really butch lesbians, or, you know, or not.
Yes. Yeah.
And so if somebody said to me, "Oh, you know, how about this? Do you feel like you are really a male, and do you feel uncomfortable in with your tits? Do you feel uncomfortable being a lesbian?" I'd have gone, "Oh God, yes, that's me. You know, that is exactly how I felt." So I feel like I can understand it a lot, but I feel really painful because a lot of people I really love and respect are kind of, you know, what would be kind of called on the kind of trans exclusionary feminist side of things. And then there are lots of people I really love and respect who are kind of very much around kind of trans rights. So I don't know. I'm being a bit titty on the fence, aren't I? But I just feel like I don't want to fucking take a position on it, you know?
Yeah, I find it
crazy to me.
I can totally appreciate the point that you're making, in that I guess the way it's being framed is that gender is an absolute, and it isn't necessarily, and you're like the way you perform gender or the way you feel about your gender can shift over time.
Yes.
But I don't know. I feel like if you know that you're in the wrong gender, you should be able to transition without that being a problem for everyone. And I just, lots of the arguments remind me of things that I was hearing when I was growing up, like, oh, if we teach kids about being gay, then they're all going to want to be gay. And that's like obviously not true. And it's kind of the same arguments now, like, oh, if we let kids think that they can be trans, then they're all going to want to be trans, and that's just a fashion statement. And I just don't think that's true.
I think it's probably a paradigm shift in how people kind of understand themselves. I think if I'm optimistic, I think actually it's probably a foretaste of the future, where people have a very different relationship to gender. I hope so.
Yeah.
Because, what I saw, I mean, I don't know, I feel like I really need to cut this bit out. I feel like I'm not expressing myself really well, but lots of my experience of we've cut to the core here a bit, of being young and seeing those butches in those, clubs in Manchester, and having a kind of visceral kind of repulsion, because like it was like, I can't be that. I can't, it felt so sad and difficult. And it was, I mean, a lot of the times it was. I don't think I was being particularly judgmental or something. There was loads of those clubs I went to, that scene I was in, people were alcoholic, they were poor, they were, there was a very kind of material deprivation to their lives. There was quite a lot of domestic abuse between lesbians. It wasn't like, oh yeah, it's just, good old butch and good old femme. There was lots of real pain that went along with those identities.
Yeah, and I mean, the thing that I can relate it to is like, hyper feminine men. And so my first experiences in gay bars was just like, oh, I don't want to associate with them, because of the way I was conditioned to believe that, there was something, I mean, obviously I was also conditioned to believe there was something wrong with me, but it was almost tolerable if I could be somewhat masculine in my presentation. And to see these hyper feminine men in those spaces was really jarring and really something that I wanted to not associate myself with. And that's kind of their experience, which is shit. And I feel really bad that that's how I responded.
Yeah, I don't know where this is going, but I think this, like my feelings on trans stuff, I really kind of complicate, and I actually don't really talk about them very much because I don't want to be a complete dick to anybody. I don't want to kind of piss anybody off, but my own,
life experience.
Yeah, my own life experience makes me incredibly complicated about it. All I can say is also at the time it was like, a lot. I was quite traumatized, and also it's like not having a language for something.
Yeah,
I'm doing it's in my kind of day job kind of thing. I'm doing some kind of research about shame, and I'm just about to do a podcast on shame.
Oh.
I mean, the lots of various kind of theories around it, but one of them is like the idea of like having a negative core belief about yourself. It's kind of formed before language, so it's never articulated to yourself. So I think a lot of, it's not like you have the words for the thing you're experiencing because you've never had the words. And a lot of my, being a lesbian, being repelled by butch lesbians, not understanding who I was, hiding a bit behind a kind of punk identity, was also, I just didn't feel like I had the way to understand myself because I didn't have the words in my vocabulary. They weren't there. And I was thinking about this podcast, and in about 1991, I think it would be, I was working for a record company. So I went on a press jaunt to New York, and I went to a club called the Click Club on kind of meatpacking district in New York. Mm-hmm. And it was very, in 91, it was very kind of clearly a queer space. And I went to the Click Club, and it was like, oh my God, this is what I've been searching for. This makes sense to me. So when I kind of came across kind of a New York version of queer, that did make sense to me. But all my experiences before that had just been very confusing because I didn't have that kind of language.
So what was it then about that made sense?
It was it was inclusive and not inclusive. God, that was a bland word. Kind of, like community centre, isn't it? It felt like there were women there who were, Black African American women. There were women who were Asian, but it wasn't like some kind of middle class lesbian thing. It was just like there were women who were fat, thin. There were women just who were, it was just a huge mix of people enjoying themselves. It was like a Peaches video or something, and it was just really cool. And it was like people not giving a damn, enjoying themselves. And I think, in a way you could sort of say that the early clubs in Manchester I went to, like Pick and Dickens, people were not giving a damn, but there was an edge of desperation there.
Mm.
And there was an edge of real kind of, pain. And of course, in New York, but of course I was a tourist as well. But I mean, in New York, it was just like a real celebration of queer. It felt like we can be who we want. And I remember but there were kind of naked women dancing on the bar, and there were kind of sex toy workshops going on and things like that. And
you didn't share, did you?
I didn't. I think I wandered around kind of a bit like, oh my God. And also, it's like, oh, I don't know, it was just so liberating. I remember.
But yeah, isn't that fascinating? I mean, so yeah, notwithstanding that you had holiday spectacles on at the time,
yeah.
is it that, this is going to come out, please no one from Manchester get really angry at me. Is it because the working class background of Manchester and the general climate of the 70s?
Yeah. It's like it was such a fucking grim city. It was horrible. It was really interesting because it was really, really kind of the centre of the city was really sparsely populated, and it was really, really run down, and everywhere so the venues I'm talking about would be shut down these days due to kind of
asbestos and
safety kind of like okay, they were filthy, they were horrible, and they were in fire trap kind of buildings, and it was just. What was good was it was a bit like New York in the 70s, where people talk about that, or 80s, people are kind of Lower East Side scene. It's like because the centre was so destitute, people could live there.
Mm.
It was really, really cheap, and you could inhabit the centre of this really, really rundown city. But it was really grim, and the club that came, so eventually I think kind of Oozits shut, and the Richard Boone's Beach Club only went on for about a year, and I think that's kind of 81ish. So Oozits shut, and then around that time a club called Swithin's opened, and it was in the basement, and in order to get a license they had to serve food. There's no one. My sister came in one. My sister's a lesbian, so, poor mother. They had to serve food, so you go sort of down into this basement, sit just in like two rooms, like nothing, it was like awful kind of strip lighting almost. And a really fat bloke in a vest used to come round at about midnight with plates of sausages and chips and like slap them down for people. And it was like it was part of them kind of keeping their license. So and the DJ was just awful. The DJ would like play something and a few people would dance, and she'd kind of go, "Right, girls, you like that one," and put the kind of needle back at the beginning of the record again. And it
played the same song.
Yeah. There was probably about 20, like 20 of us lesbians that used to sit in this basement eating sausage and chips at, midnight, while some kind of like it was the owner's husband in his vest would literally, it's like some big fat kind of northern bloke in a vest, some greasy kind of sleazy guy was wandering around, and we'd all dance to the same record again and again, and it was bizarre, but it was bizarre in retrospect. But at the time, it was just like, well, that's what it is. This is the height of clubbing in Manchester. People, here we are.
So the kind of the main difference is in Manchester there was like nowhere else to go.
No, well, I think there was sort of there was a gay club called DeVille's, but that was, again, it was kind of men, and it was like slightly more. I was really poor, right? Like, I was really, really, really poor. So a lot of the places I went because they're free sausage and chips. No, I was like, fuck a meal. But you know, they were where the poor people went. They were very working class, and yeah, they were cheap. I can't remember how much any of them were to get into, but I'm sure they weren't much, or they were free. But in terms of other clubs in Manchester at the time, there was a club called DeVille's, and I think there were a couple of more kind of gay men's clubs towards Deansgate, which is the posh end of town. But there wasn't a lot, you know. It wasn't sort of. I mean, clubbing in Manchester only really arrives in. I went to there were the few kind of black clubs, and I went to one in I can't remember what it was called. A really famous hip hop club, so that must have been kind of early 80s. And so clubbing only starts happening kind of early 80s, and I think Hacienda. When does Hacienda arrive? I guess like 82, I think. It's very early Hacienda as well. So yeah, it felt like before that, clubs, what I described as clubs are, you know, you would be horrified.
Some man in a string vest handing out sausages.
Exactly.
So you've just mentioned that your sister is a lesbian.
Yes.
So is she older than you, younger than you?
Older than me. And when I was a young lesbian, she was a straight.
Oh, I see. I was going to say, so did that not open the door for you? Or you opened the door for her?
Yeah. She listened to it. Yeah, I did actually. Yeah, I think so.
Or there's something like I've heard from other people that have a gay sibling that the one who comes out second feels like there's an additional pressure because they're going to let their parents down even more.
I've never talked to my sister really about we're a family of great not talkers about things, but yeah, I don't really know how she felt about you know, like what that kind of pressure meant on her. She came a bit sort of like a lot old later on, and she just kind of was, you know, kind of having relationships with men. We could make her sound like a loose woman. Men. She just had, you know, she had sort of normal, you know, kind of like quite important relationships with men. And then I'm guessing in her 20s, late 20s, kind of came out. But it was useful. I mean, she was an ally, and she's a lovely, lovely woman. I love her very much. And she was always a real kind of ally for me in those early days. And then she went to college in London she moved down to London, I think 79. So also she was kind of away from the house, and my dad was dead. So, you know, in a way it was just me and my mum during a lot of those times of upheaval. My sister was away at university, and she came down to London in 79 and then kind of stayed. And in the early 80s, I was hitching down to London to visit her, and then I started to go to the Bell and kind of London clubs like that. So kind of felt like I needed. It's funny, I felt like I needed to get out of Manchester because it felt really small, and it didn't have what I needed. But yeah, I couldn't keep going to the Dickens and Picador and the Union. I was really kind of looking for something else. I found it a bit in London in the Bell, and that kind of early 80s London scene certainly felt kind of different enough for me.
Did you ever go to the Picador or any of the other venues discussed in today's episode? Well, if you did, tell me all about it. Find me on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Connect with me and let me know your stories. My username across all platforms is KAndersonMusic. Lost Spaces is not only a podcast, but a concept record as well. I've been writing songs about queer venues and experiences and the people who used to live their lives there, and will be releasing songs over the coming year. You can hear the first single, Well Grown Boys, which is also playing underneath my talking right now on all good streaming platforms. If you liked this episode, I would really appreciate if you subscribed, left a review on Apple Podcasts, or just told people who you think might be interested to have a little listen as well. I am Kay Anderson, and you have been listening to Lost Spaces.